Hello, this is Tom, aka Gedeon here for Tabletop Tap Room, and we're going to be looking at orcs, racism in Dungeons and Dragons, and for today. And mostly, we're going to be looking at a little post I saw on Twitter that I was looking at, thinking nothing in this here actually makes any sense, but we'll get to that. But first, let me just say thanks for watching the video. Thanks to my subscribers. You guys are great. And if you've not subscribed, please do hit the like, subscribe, bell icon. Help me build the channel. I appreciate it. And moving right along. So the post I saw was here, and we're going to evaluate this just based off of what it's asserting. I think that's fair. Somebody asserts to me something, I start thinking about what it was that they said. So it says here, thousands of years of game lore and setting-based racial animosity was cured in 2014. If you include old world racial, read racist, tropes, seek counseling and admonish your parents for raising you poorly. Unless they're already ashamed of you. And we get this little art here, Orc Lives Matter, and the orcs carrying a mace. So I got thinking about it. It says thousands of years of game lore. Now, I'm a little bit more up on the history of gaming than some people. I think because of a fascination with archaeology. For instance, backgammon and checkers, there's archaeological evidence that these games are 5,000 years old. They are not considered the oldest games, but Senet, the Egyptian game Senet, is 5,500 years old, is the evidence that we have for that. We're not really sure how to play the game Senet. But these are board games, and there's really no game lore there for orcs at all. In fact, the genre of board games is quite different from the genre of RPGs. Board games existed for a long time, and it was very much one player against another player. In rare circumstances in ancient times, you'd get like the game called Chinese checkers, where you could have multiple players playing against each other. But originally the very first board games was one player versus one player. And then they began to diversify over time that you can have more players in a game. Fun. So there's no game lore there concerning orcs being bad, orcs are evil, orcs are anything. First of all, but out of board games in the 1800s, early 1900s, you then began to get war games to evolve. And there might be some precedents going further back for war games. But war games began to evolve. And out of war games came from a group called Tactical Study Rules. From Gygax and Arneson, you came a watershed moment in gaming where you had role-playing games, but in this watershed moment, it's the first time in history that you had all the players cooperating together towards a goal. Always before this, in the history of gaming, it was two sides, heads against each other, is how gaming went. But for the first time ever, you had this watershed moment of all the players are now cooperating together. You have a non-player who's kind of a caller, a referee, game master, dungeon master, whatever you call him. But it's not necessarily that the game master is against the players. Now, some game masters view themselves that way. I've heard of games where the game master very much has got it out. I'm here, and and if you buck the system, I'll kill your character, just like that. I've heard of those games, yes, but that's not really how role-playing games are played. That the game master, it's the game master versus the players. It really is not. The game master is there to be an impartial judge and an arbiter of the rules and just keep the game going. Sometimes he's there to help push the story along. If you're part of the Hickman Revolution, you tend to follow that style of game. But the first time in history you had cooperative games, and now you have board games, like Zombicide, where the players work together. And if you don't work together, it's going to get ugly fast, and the team's going down. So you do now have board games that have adopted this cooperative style, where it's the players trying to serve. It's man versus environment tropes, kind of. It's the team versus the rules mechanic of the game just work against you. And so you now even have that in board games. But the first time in history you ever had cooperative play by players working towards the same goals came about with Gygax and Arneson. So this idea of thousands of years of game lore is just wrong, because you do have thousands of years of game history, but it was for board game, and a couple hundred years of wargaming history, but it's only 50 years of RPG history. So you don't have this thousands of years of game lore of prejudice against the orcs. Thousands of years. Is there no mercy for the orc son? Is there? It's logically illogical. It's just a fallacy. So that is the first assertion here in this. And then the next is, because of the word and thousands of years of setting-based racial animosity. And again, we're only talking 50 years. Setting-based racial animosity. But that doesn't even really bear up. Because what's really interesting is that when you go back, now I don't have a copy of the white box, but my gaming experience goes back to both of these editions, because I got this one first, and then I started, when these books started turning up at the gaming store, and one of my players in my game showed up with one of these, I was suddenly like, I gotta have one. I gotta get me one. And so suddenly lawnmower money, snow shoveling money was being hoarded. Instead of for the arcade, it was being saved to get hardcover books. Now, what's interesting with these is that if you go into the chapter on monsters in here, you find dwarves, gnomes, elves, halflings, right alongside orcs. They were all opponents. They were all potential opponents. Did orcs get more play? Sure. Yes. But also the same in here. Dwarves, elves, gnomes, orcs, they were all in there as potential opponents. So this idea that there's this setting-based racial animosity begins to break down, because elves were considered opponents, potential opponents, dwarves. In fact, the wandering monster tables, you'd be rolling on those, and it could come up a party of dwarves. And you could just as easily have a bad reaction roll, do a reaction roll, and roll badly. Roll a 2d6. And so if you came up snake eyes, you'd get a 2. That would be a bad reaction. And so now you're fighting a party of dwarves. You could just as well encounter a party of orcs and roll a 12. And they're very amiable to negotiate with you. And so this idea that the setting mandated racial animosity really breaks down when you start digging into the actual editions. It doesn't hold water. To be certain, yes, orcs did feature as cannon fodder in dungeons and dungeon crawls and mega dungeons. Yeah, same as everything else. And but there's no thousands of years. The assertion that there's thousands of years of this breaks down simply because it's only 50 years of history, no thousands of years. Is setting-based racial animosity bad? You start getting into the need for an implacable enemy. In epic type games and stories, you need an implacable enemy. And we just had that just recently in the MCU with Thanos and whatever those creatures were he was leading. I really didn't catch their name, but they could just as easily have been orcs and how they were portrayed. They could have just as easily been orcs, and Thanos was the Dark Lord. And that wizard that gets taken out by Tony Stark in the ship, that wizard guy, and is taken out by Tony and Doctor Strange and Spider-Man or Spider-Boy, depending on your interpretation. He could have been the mouth of Sauron at the gates of Sauron, in the Return of the King. You could have just as easily recast all of those characters of that, and the story still works. There is a place for the implacable enemy. For instance, in the original Star Trek, we kind of had 3 real implacable enemies that you could not negotiate with. You had Klingons, you had Romulans, you had Betholians. I would say the Gorn, but that was an interesting thing where it was just the Gorn captain versus our hero captain, and there was an offer on the table. And so that captain may not have been a representative for his whole species, and he might have just been like, look, very competitive and I want to win. So he was implacable in playing the duel, the game that had been set. That table had been set by more powerful energy godlike creatures. So let's take the Gorn off the table, but you had Klingons, Romulans, and the Tholians as implacable enemies in the original Star Trek. And you kept getting implacable enemies introduced in Star Trek. Why? Because they're necessary for epic stories to have these kind of enemies. And your enemy does not always have to stay an implacable enemy. See, Klingons were presented first as an implacable enemy. You could not negotiate with them. You just it's shoot first, ask questions later. But then with the Next Generation, they introduced a Klingon officer in Starfleet, Worf, one of the most popular characters of all time. Michael Dorn has more screen time as his character than any other actor ever. Worf has appeared more on film, in TV and film, than any other character in Star Trek history. Michael Dorn even portrayed his Worf's grandfather in The Undiscovered Country, which was just, I thought, cool. So with the introduction of Worf, the Klingons moved, and the Next Generation Klingons kind of moved, and they were no longer the implacable enemy. They became an ally, and they became a crucial ally in Deep Space Nine against the Dominion, and it became much more interesting. And so after the advent of the TNG, even Iron Crown Enterprises, when they introduced HARP, High Adventure Role Playing. And if you've not seen High Adventure Role Playing, basically, I would characterize their High Adventure Role Playing as if their Rolemaster system and their Middle Earth role playing system had a one night stand, and one of them got pregnant and then had a baby. That would be HARP. And HARP was really fascinating because they introduced an analog for the half-orc race. And they called them the Grix. They were kind of a quasi-bestial type of race. They called them the Grix. But the artwork really said Klingon. They really had the brow ridges. They had Batleth sword. It looked just like the Batleth. Clearly, they were riffing off TNG Klingons. And so even an implacable enemy doesn't have to stay an implacable enemy. They can move over time. and transition. So there's the setting animosity. I just don't see it, because you could just as easily have foes that are the dwarves. We then get this next statement that all of this was cured in 2014. Well, the problem with that statement is that those are non-issues. These non-issues that don't really exist were somehow cured. But then the next statement is if you include old world racial, read racist tropes, seek counseling, admonish your parents for raising you poorly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The following statement invalidates the cure, because if it was cured, then it's gone. I mean, if you had a disease and the disease is cured, the disease is gone. Okay? So the next statement implies that the cure didn't take. So even the statement that it was cured in 2014 is illogical. Their own statement here just says, no, not true. It was not cured in 2014. There's still a large segment of people who are playing D&D the way it was originally written. And orcs are still evil. They're still lawful evil. You know? Now, this last bit, I looked into old world racial tropes. You Google that. By and large, what you mostly find is New World American racial tropes popping up about Aunt Jemima, Uncle Tom, minstrel shows, which have a New World origin. There was some minstrel shows going on in England, but for the most part, we're talking, this is modern history in the last 150 years. And these tropes that they single out when you Google old words tropes are much more modern in origin. And they're not old world tropes, they're American tropes, post-Civil War, effectively. Because there were still people who were committed to racism, even though you won the war and you've ended it legislatively, you still had this thing plaguing our society because there were still people committed to the way they believed. Just winning the war didn't end it. You still had problems. And I did a lot of searching, looking for these old world tropes. They cite examples that are medieval, that kind of break down when you really dig into them, that, oh, well, it's this Greek thing that got passed on to medieval society. It just breaks down under scrutiny when you start to scrutinize it. And then the rest here about seeking counseling and admonish your parents, it's just gaslighting. So there's nothing in this Orc Lives Matter post on Twitter that logically holds together. There's nothing here that logically holds together. However, looking at the word orc, even looking at the origin of the word orc, the etymology of it, it's a word with some ancient origins, but it goes back to Latin, to Orcus, god of the underworld. It's really the word Orcus is related to hell and the underworld. It went into Latin as orco. It was indicative of demons and monsters. Monsters were closely associated with demons. They were an implacable boogeyman used in stories to scare children, to scare people, that as those monsters, but also became related to the word ogre. And then in English, in Old English, was monsters, but it also had a connotation of sea monsters. And so in English, we get a ferocious sea creature of an orc, but also again, this idea of monsters, even in English, closely related to ogre. What you have with orc is a modern interpretation of orc really comes to us from Tolkien, where he's looking at these words, and I need a creature for my epic high fantasy good versus evil. And so he goes back into ancient lore and he finds this word for monsters, also translated ogre, also connected to ogre. And he uses this word orc and essentially creates the modern understanding of orc as a monster, an implacable monster that the heroes face and face down in his Middle-earth stories and The Hobbit. There's no setting animosity here because his intent was I need an evil creature, and I'm going to use this ancient word connected to ogre and monsters, and I'm going to put a spin on it. And Gygax, we know that Gygax and possibly Arneson stole from Tolkien. They stole from history. They used a lot of things in history. And just said, we need a world where there's monsters are real. So any monster we can find in medieval history, kobolds, goblins, pixies, whatever, we're imagining a world where they're real. We know that there was a lawsuit, Tolkien Enterprises against was TSR Incorporated because of their use of the halflings, the hobbits, and the Balrog in Zero D&D. So, yeah, we know that he stole from this and that they just borrowed and used everything. They got away with taking orc because of the name's ancient origins connected to monsters. And everything you fought was just considered a monster, whether it was a dwarf, whether it was a gnome, whether it was an elf, didn't matter. They were all rated as monsters, and you got EXP from them. Now, if in a world where we say, oh, racist to be killing orcs lives matter, ultimately, every monster's life matters. So you're going to have to find a conception of role-playing games where there is no killing because all lives really matter. Because it won't stop with the orcs. Well, then it's goblin lives matter. What? Wait a minute. Orcs were connected to ogres etymologically. So ogres' lives must matter. You know, killing ogres is racial somehow. And so it won't stop with orcs and drow. It'll just expand. And ultimately, I mean, if this word orc was connected to the word ogre, then don't ogre lives matter? I would think, right? And potentially because of orco and orcus are the roots of this word, then don't demon lives matter? So you begin to strip out the whole monster manual and, well, we can't kill anything that's organized and intelligent. So we can fight giant beetles and wargs. Well, next thing you know, it's going to be PETA saying you're teaching people to treat animals unethically. That makes your game evil. So therefore, warg lives matter and giant beetle lives matter. And we can no longer kill wargs and giant fire beetles and giant spiders. It doesn't stop. Logically, it goes places that become ludicrous. So, yeah, I think you could take orcs and make them a race. Move them like Klingons moved in Star Trek. No longer the implacable enemy. And because they're no longer the implacable enemy, we need a new implacable enemy. It's the Borg. Go and talk to them. Couldn't negotiate with them. Borg just do what Borg just do. But then, as time goes on, we meet the Borg Queen. And boy, was she a great enemy. She's trying to seduce Data. Data's being seduced by the flesh, oof, when he gets the actual human skin on his arm. And then it goes so far as in Star Trek Picard that the Borg Queen becomes somebody that Picard and company side with for help and aid, to go back in time to try to fix the timeline. And so suddenly she's gone from this implacable enemy to somebody that we don't trust her, but we do negotiate with her. It's part of that evolution. So then you need a new implacable enemy to come along. And Star Trek was always good about if we move somebody from being implacable, we now have to get a new space orc, new non-negotiable, terrible enemy to fight. And stories need this, because if you strip out all the orcs and ogres and demons, and then in some crazy future where oh geez, we can't kill wolves and fire beetles and spiders and whatever, giant centipedes, that's inhumane. Pete is upset when we can't do that. What do you fight? And and maybe you are going to be more comfortable with an RPG where there is no fighting. There are other means of gaining experience points, but there is no fighting. I don't know. How do you have stories? How do you have stories without conflict? How do you, it breaks down. So you have story-based games and there's no fighting. These are not going to be very exciting games. It's just not. It's just not how story structure works for the human mind. It's not the stories we like. We like a little bit of conflict. We like epic stories, and epic stories thrive on conflict and implacable enemies. So, yeah, this whole thing of Orc Lives Matter, it breaks down because it's illogical. I don't see the connection. You can assert, oh, orcs were black people. Well, you need to prove that. You need to demonstrate that. You need to go point, 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 point. And therefore, and it really breaks down. They were a monster. People reached back in the history, says, oh, here's this word for a monster. We're going to use that. And just because you want to see racism in everything doesn't mean it's there. So my judgment is play the game the way you like. You're still going to need an implacable enemy to have epic stories. So if you move orcs from being your classic monster to being one of a plethora of fantasy races, you can do that. We've seen it done with Klingons, and it was great. One of the most popular characters in history, Michael Dorn as Worf. You can do that. You're still going to need a Borg. You're still going to need an implacable enemy. And maybe your campaign is just about the undead. They're implacable. Can't negotiate with them. Undead and demons. Although, yeah, logically speaking, if orcs are human, then demons must be human, and demon lives matter too. It gets insane when you go down that path too far. So you can move them. You can move orcs out of the implacable enemy sphere. Absolutely. But this idea that, well, because orcs have this alignment and they're lawful good, it breaks down the Manichean good versus evil system of the world, because by following law, they're following the forces of good. So therefore, you can't have a village of evil orcs. They're evil because we said they're evil. They're evil because the author said they're evil. They're evil because the story required an evil force for the heroes to fight, not because people were racist. Gaming is about stories. And for epic stories, you've got to have epic enemies. And those enemies have to have some evil in them. They have to be a Thanos. They have to be a Sauron. You have to have the Borg. There must be implacable enemies for our stories to work and for our gaming to work. So this is Tom for Tabletop Taproom signing out. Thanks for watching the video. Hey, disagree with me? Please leave a comment and keep on gaming. And I'll see you out there at the gaming tables.